Today, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Anthony Wood, who is a historian of Montana and the West. His work focuses on the history of race and community building in the 19th and 20th centuries. He graduated with his MA from Montana State and his Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. In 2021, he published his first book, which was Black Montana, Settler Colonialism and the Erosion of the Racial Frontier. So his talk today comes from work he did this summer as a Humanities Montana Fellow with the United We Stand Scholars Project. So without further ado, Anthony, welcome.
As long as that's on, okay. I was worried there was going to be a do, but now there's not. All right, well, thanks everyone for having me. It's really nice to be here. Thank you to the Historical Society and to Laura and everyone who's helped put this talk together. I'll mention it a little bit later on, but I also want to say thanks to the folks at Humanities Montana who supported, which was what was really just like interesting, unstructured free time for me to think and ponder through some ideas that I didn't know quite what to do with. So by way of an introduction here, I am going to start with a little bit of my kind of academic background, how I came to working on Black history. I think I recognize some people from other talks I've done in the past few years, so some of this might be a little redundant, but it kind of the trajectory moves us into the discussion on race, wilderness, and the stories that we tell about ourselves. Nature, wilderness, and the stories that we tell about ourselves. As Laura mentioned, I finished my MA from Montana State University in 2018, and that project, which I had the great fortune of having a lot of research already there in place, came mostly out of work I did here at the Montana Historical Society with Kate Hampton as part of their the Montana African American Heritage Places project. I got roped in as an undergraduate intern when I was at Carroll College, and then got very fortunate and lucky to be hired as a consultant right afterwards. I was mostly doing legwork. I was going through censuses and looking for names and finding buildings and extant houses around Helena and Montana. And by the end of that project, what we had done is I had done maybe just some of the grunt labor to map really every Black community in Montana from the 1870s through the 1930s. And with that, I got spreadsheets and files with everyone's names and occupations and their family and everything that censuses have and how long they lived at what place. And as I kind of moved into grad school doing the social history type of work, that became an incredible resource for me to write my first book, which was kind of not a comprehensive history of African American communities and life in Montana during the 19th and 20th century, but it was an attempt at providing a broad overview, looking through the lens of a concept that a lot of scholars and academics were using called settler colonialism, essentially asking how race at large, and in Montana, race being primarily a conversation that includes not just white and African American, but also indigenous and Asian people through the process of kind of the expansion of the US state. That's what that looked like. So is to try and locate a history of Black Montana within this broader context. Since then, I went on to do my doctorate at the University of Michigan, which was a really wonderful experience because with kind of the book well underway and it was published while I was there, I was kind of given free rein to do whatever I wanted, which was very dangerous. And you'll see why in a second. But luckily, in the meantime, I was right with one of my conjectures that I had had during this publishing process, was that I was not going to be the only book talking about African Americans in Montana, and in fact I wasn't, and really quickly Sarah Arata, who's at Oklahoma State, wrote a wonderful biography, and kind of it's more of a micro-history actually, of Sarah Bickford from Virginia City, which you should all read, Race in the Wild West, and then quickly on the heels of that, Michael Johnson, who I believe has done a talk in this series at some point in the last few years, on the life of Rose Gordon, who I'll also talk a little bit about. Really wonderful biographies we have, and then some more thematic work on African American women, Buffalo Soldiers, and just dozens and dozens of graduate students who are now also working on African American history in the Mountain West, in the West, and even a few graduate students from around the country working specifically on Montana. So there's a lot coming. My dissertation was trying to look away from Montana for a moment to think about the West broadly, to see what could I say about black communities and black community formation at this moment when Western cities and towns were forming, being established, and kind of coming to their own sense of a community identity. That was the time period that I was interested in. And so I had widowed down a list of about a dozen possible cities to talk about to 3. I wrote on Cheyenne, Wyoming, Pueblo, Colorado, and Pocatello, Idaho. Mostly because they were places that all had really interesting black history, but that no historian at any point had ever written on the black history in those places. So those were my 3, and I was really committed to doing what I was thinking of as place-based history. I wanted to tell a place-based story, local history, but also something that was distinct and significant to that one location. So that if someone from Pocatello or from Pueblo were to pick up the book, they would recognize, the stories of the people who lived there before as, this is my history. Even if they aren't part of the black community, especially if they were though. And that was my goal. And as I was doing that, and even as I was drafting some of the first chapters on Cheyenne, I started getting a kind of a sinking feeling. And at one point, very early on, I had written a very long chapter on Cheyenne. It was like 50 or 60 pages. And I thought to myself, what if I took out all the place names in the chapter, like all the streets, and changed them to something else? And if I imagined that I just put some other town's name on the chapter instead of Cheyenne. If I could pull the the switcheroo, so to speak, and camouflage the specific things, if I were to give this to someone, would they automatically know that no, I wasn't talking about wherever, this was about somewhere else? Could I pass off one town's black history to people 100 years later who aren't surely familiar with that time period as somewhere else's? And I started getting the sinking feeling that I might be able to, which meant that place-based history, I was probably not doing it as well as I had intended. Luckily, also during this process, I had a safety net, which I hadn't realized how well it was going to work yet, and that was that in addition to telling the black stories of these places, I was really interested in talking about the history of race making, or racial ideology as it looked like in those same towns. But at first, I didn't know what that was going to be at all. So when I started doing those chapters, very worried that I was writing just a very surface level history of a place, and that in fact I was writing a kind of a black history that was really similar or had almost all the same markers as any other town in the West, and there wasn't actually anything really place specific about it. It might have been regionally specific, but might not have been place specific. As I started doing the work on the other half of the dissertation on the history of race in those towns, something very interesting and lucky happened to me. And that is that as I tried to find instances of local newspapers, politicians, community leaders talking about race in the 19th century, which is not hard. If you think people talk about race today, they have absolutely nothing on the late 19th century and the early 20th century. People talked about it constantly. Every issue of every paper features dozens of articles or editorials on the issue, and you can get a really good sense, even from just local newspapers, let alone laws and customs, what they were thinking in terms of the creation of racial categories and so on. But as I looked through those specific places, so in Cheyenne, as they spoke about race, and Pueblo as they spoke about race, and Pocatello as they spoke about race, they did not repeat verbatim what I knew to be the broader national or even regional ideas that circulated at that time. Instead, what they were doing is they were telling stories about themselves, and I mean really about themselves, about their local heroes, their legends, their myths, their own local history that literally could not transfer from one town to another. Sometimes they couldn't even transfer from one part of town to the other. And in the process of telling those stories, race made an appearance over and over and over again. And at that time, I started recognizing just how much the process of placemaking, these towns are very new when this is going on. These towns are growing, people are moving in and out, and they're trying to come to a sense of themselves. The process of placemaking was always being tied up with the process of race making. That is, the construction of racial categories, deciding who's white. Are you from Italy? Are you white? Are you Greek? Well, you might be white. Are you Irish? Are you not quite white? I mean, there's a litany of categories just with the kind of the ethnic immigrants. And then determining whether or not a racial category then put one individual or family into a subsection of, do you belong in this community? Are you really part of us? Are you the center, the core, the pillar of the community? Are you the, this one showed up all the time, are you the element of town that moves in and out? These cities in early days were very, very transient, and people moved in and out. And it's very easy, and I saw it over and over again, to put racial others, not so much to denigrate them, but to simply categorize them in the way they spoke about them, into categories that moved them to, the people who are not really ever gonna stay. They're here to work, they're gonna go somewhere else. They're not the core of our communities. So, with that, I started trying to think about how can I say, how can I discuss kind of in a broader sense what is going on with that type of phenomena. And I landed on a phrase which I used kind of by happenstance in the epilogue of my book, the stories that we tell about ourselves. Because they were stories. Some of them were history, some of them were hard, fast, statistical history. Some of the stories were apocryphal tales, like demonstrably false things that everyone repeated over and over again. But more than this, the stories that people told about themselves, as I would find like one individual story. For instance, in Pocatello, there was a pageant that I was interested in, a history pageant around the formation of Old Fort Hall, and the very first, supposedly the first sermon preached by a Protestant west of the mountains. I was looking for that story in particular, and I found it all over the place in the 1920s and 30s, and then I found it all over the place in the 1990s, when they redid the pageant for centennials and other commemorative events. And I realized that, stories that we tell about ourselves don't really stop. We often keep telling them. And that led me to a fun summer of thinking about stories that we have told about ourselves. So, I'm gonna go back here. I was trying to decide, when I was working on the Humanities Montana aspect of this project, I was trying to decide how am I going to talk about race in Montana from some aspect of my book. And I think that if you want to take what I've said up to this point and really getting more information about it, maybe read my dissertation when it comes out as a book. But for the moment, I've also recognized that the stories that we were telling about ourselves are not always, they don't always have to be specifically about the process of making racial categories. Sometimes they can just simply be about the process of defining what kind of community we are. What are our values? What are the things that we want to kind of elevate to take the prime place in our society as markers of identity and belonging? And to that end, I suddenly realized, while I was standing outside the Big Dipper with my toddler on my shoulder as we watched the Vigilante Day parade, that the stories that I had encountered doing dissertation work, I was watching them go by over and over again. And I don't know why this is the case. Now, I went and looked at some great old photos. You can see, like, the Prayer of Jedediah Smith. They used to do all the work for us. They used to just tell us the narrative, the story that they were retelling on the side. The building of the first railroad, and this is a very long tradition in Helena, and I've now watched it many times. I don't know why it only just now landed to me this year as I was watching it. There must be no rules at all on whether or not a group of students repeat an idea that someone else in the parade has already chosen. Which, at first, you suppose, like, well, that's boring, they're not being very inventive, but for me, it's like, this is data. Like, I get to see which narratives either their history and civics teachers are commending to them, that they are, been passed down. I have to imagine that the Eddie's Bread Company float is just every year, just the transitive property of student to student to student. They don't even know why they're doing it anymore. Someone just has to do an Eddie's Bread. This is, I think, a kind of a delightful thing because it all let us watch Ted Kaczynski get arrested like 8 times, which is, I thought was actually kind of fun. But that was not the most common float. Before I go to the next slide, in case anyone hasn't seen it, does anyone want to guess what the most common float was this year?
Mann Gulch.
So, this is an interesting phenomena which I was not planning on making it part of my research. I simply got interested because it was everywhere. And it's been everywhere for, if you look around in the summer, you'll still hear it in August. But this year, with the 75th anniversary, we really, as a community, got a first-hand account, which is why I'm going to talk about it for a little while, of what I call the creation or the maintenance of our narrative community, the stories that we're telling about ourselves. With this in mind, I'm going to guess, we can do a raise of hands, how many people think they participated either as, speakers, retelling the story, mentioning it to someone, or just listening in an engaged way to something about Mann Gulch this year? This is about what I imagined. So, in case you haven't seen it, Mann Gulch was a forest fire, an event in 1949 in which 13 smoke jumpers, some of the first smoke jumpers in use, parachuted into a fire north of town, perished with the exception of the foreman and 2 others. The foreman lit a breaker fire in front of him, and that may or may not, although likely, kind of depressed the flames in such a way that they were able to survive while the other men who tried to reach the top of the hill and ran from the fire could not. So that's essentially the story. And we have to ask, I think, 2 questions to be critical members of our narrative communities, as we all are. Do you know why this story, as opposed to many other very important historical events, was the feature of like 15-something floats at our Vigilante Day parade? And if you know why it is, do we know that the meaning that its original storytellers, the people who first kind of injected it into our narrative communities, the meaning that they had, why they thought it mattered to tell, do we know if that's the same meaning that we heard all summer long? Yeah, sorry. Oop, there we go. So, the reason, I think most people, if you think about it, and if you're a well-read person, you'll know that the reason we know about Mann Gulch is because Norman Maclean made us know about Mann Gulch. If there is a Mount Rushmore of Montana literary figures, the fact that Norman Maclean is probably on almost everybody's list of 4 for Montana writers from the 20th century is kind of surprising, considering he wrote 1 book, died, and then they published his second one. If you were to put the other people who often make it on that list, someone like Ivan Doig or Wallace Stegner, one of the most significant historians and fictionists of the 20th century West, or Mildred Walker or Dorothy Johnson, who had 17 novels and 3 mega hits that all became huge movies, how Norman Maclean gets on everybody's list is kind of interesting, but I think that part of the reason is that he is a very eloquent, complicated, honest commentator on the relation between man and nature and what that means for kind of the broader human experience. And that is not the case, and it is not the case everywhere, I have found, but Montanans hear those stories. We think about our own relationships with the natural world, and because we find so much value in the kind of the insights that Maclean have, we elevate not only him, but almost most stories about humans and nature to this very important part. And it's just why I think we have learned so much about Mann Gulch this year, but it's also why stories of man and nature kind of continue to be kind of the mainstay of our narrative communities in many ways. Now, I would also say, we'll go back to the second question now. Do we know if the meaning of these stories have changed? Because I'm going to guess that has anyone read Man and Fire recently? How much, I'll ask maybe a rhetorical question, how much of Norman Maclean's ideas, what he meant in his narrative do you think you heard on little news broadcasts and maybe, a couple public presentations this summer? For the most part, I would guess that you heard one of two narrative meanings. The first is that this is an event which helps us to remember people who made great sacrifices, who went out and put their lives on the line for other people's safety. You might have heard it spun in a way in which it feels a little militarized, in which they become, the paratroopers are frontline soldiers fighting a war against nature. You get that kind of language. I heard that multiple times from news reports. The second issue, if you're in the fire community, is you would have heard about the reason why we tell the story of Mann Gulch is because Mann Gulch, its events, commanded a different type of approach to managing fire, lighting fires in controlled ways to stop larger blow-ups later on. Norman Maclean certainly knew about that. He was a firefighter himself, but that's not what Norman Maclean wrote about. I mean, he had both of those things sort of in the periphery, but Norman Maclean wrote a book about the existential struggle with oneself to know oneself. Now, that's not a very catchy thing to talk about in breweries at the 10 Mile where they'd have done public talks, but that is the original narrative, kind of the genesis of this story being so impactful and kind of being so commonly retold in our community. But it's only taken 30-some years, my lifetime, and we have shifted slightly on the meanings. We have chosen to elevate one meaning or one didactic way of telling the story over another. So as I was thinking through this, you'll also know that, before I go on, you'll also notice that the type of story that was originally told, this is the 1950s movie, Red Skies Over Montana, which kind of vaguely uses the event. You probably can see from this not just like the design of the movie poster, but also the title, Red Skies of Montana. This is a Cold War story. This is a very different type of story than Norman Maclean told. This is a story about an external threat, and you have to fight it, and it's almost unbeatable, but you have to go and fight it anyway. It's a very plain kind of one-to-one comparison with communism, whereas Norman Maclean wrote and rewrote his draft of Young Men with Fire as the Cold War ended, being published a year after the Berlin Wall came down. And it's very kind of classic of post-Cold War literature. You're looking outwards, and then suddenly you turn inwards when the external threat seems to diminish. But as I was thinking about this, I was reflecting on what my study in Black history, and specifically what one chapter in Black Montana on the Black wilderness experience did to the way I related to my participation in this narrative community. And as I was doing this talk, I actually wrote it out, the whole thing at one point, and as I was deciding, it's like, I shouldn't do a talk about storytelling by reading it, I should just tell the story. There was one section that I could not bring myself to possibly mess up, so I have a short bit here that I want to make sure I get very right. But it regards that phrase that I'm using, narrative communities. So like many facets of our daily lives, our community's engagement with the outdoors and the wilderness has a history which can be explored both critically and with celebration in the stories that we tell about ourselves. These stories, told and retold over time, make up what I've called narrative communities. Historians, and I think history lovers in general, are usually focused on stories about the past. We frequently care about events or processes that are revealed maybe in less narrative forms of sources, like censuses or immigration documentation, or things like that, newspapers even. And then we work really hard to shape those sources into stories about the past through our interpretation and analysis. I think we do our best, but more often than not, the storyteller who has the most indelible mark on a community's shared sense of identity is not the historian as storyteller, but rather it's history as storyteller. In Montana, I think this is clear in our elevation of stories about humans and nature. Stories of this sort, which filter down through the years, are usually experiential. And for that reason, we feel far more comfortable being our own interpreters of what those stories mean. These are stories about experiences. We have those experiences. We can empathize with the experience itself, and then we can say to ourselves, I know what that person meant when they told that story, because I know what it meant to me. So how many of you, though, when hearing of stories, I'll preface by saying this is not what historians typically do. We're not really into that type of interpretation. That's not very good history. But how many of you, when hearing of stories of Lewis and Clark or mountain men like Hugh Glass, think of the complex economic underpinnings of the fur trade or US settler expansion? You more likely think of exploration and the thrill, perhaps, of venturing out into the wild. Or maybe you've listened to the stories of the first Forest Service rangers or Park Service employees. Does your mind go to narratives about early 20th century ideas of masculinity and manliness, and that era's kind of attendant anxiety with those concepts and the viability of US empire abroad? Or, more likely, you think of stories of those men and the stories that they told about themselves as ones that commend solitude or hard-won self-sufficiency. My point here is that historians have been looking at one set of narrative meanings, and we've been doing this for like decades and decades and decades. This is not new. We look at one set of narrative meanings, all the while the public largely continues to be comfortable as the main interpreters of the stories about humans and nature, because they're experiential. So I think that's probably enough to give most historians and scholars panic sweats, or at least like small existential crises. But I don't actually think that's necessarily a bad thing. That, our impulse to be our own interpreters. I think we just need other things. For the last 7 years, I have been researching and writing about race and ethnicity in the West with a special attention on the types of stories that everyday people have told and continue to tell about themselves. One of the main takeaways I've had, and I don't think this is really new to my work, is that one of the reasons we're also ready to be our own historical interpreters about stories from the past is that we think that those original storytellers look a whole lot like us. Another main takeaway from my work then has been the idea that familiarizing ourselves with Black history and generally a more diverse set of stories from the past makes us slow down. We can no longer assume that everyone is exactly like us and that we know what their stories mean. Black history in Montana and the West invites us into a posture of what I've called in the past historical empathy. I tell it mostly to students as like the last day, what is my last takeaway for students as they leave my classrooms? Try to cultivate historical empathy. I think that cultivating historical empathy is important for all types of history, learning. After all, there's an old phrase that someone living today in Tokyo is probably far more like you than you are to your great-great-grandparents. Time is a great divider, and we often assume that it's a small gap when it is in fact very large. So, what can we learn then about these stories about man and nature if we take Black history into account? Well, we're going to do something I think a little different. I have in the past done talks where I've gone through some of maybe the statistics and some really fascinating stories about the Black wilderness experience. But today I want to think a little bit more about Black storytellers. And I want us to consider their commitments to Montana's history and what we can learn from it. So, interestingly enough, during the early and mid-20th century, there was a figure of profound local and literary significance who was wandering, writing, musing about nature in the hills above White Sulphur Springs. And it wasn't Ivan Doig. So this is Rose Gordon. Rose Gordon was born in 1883 in central Montana. Both of her parents had been enslaved as young people. They came west, mostly working as cooks in mining camps. Rose has this phenomenal story which she relates in her unpublished, as of yet, autobiography about her birth in the mining camp of Barker, in which she notes that she was the first non-native child to be born in the camp. And in this story that she told and retold over the years in White Sulphur Springs, in the newspaper, and to friends, and in her biography, this kind of gave her a legitimacy a nativity where she had the right to stand on the ground, so to speak, in central Montana, and then from there became one of her city's probably most prolific local history chronicler, local storyteller. She also owned a cafe, which she ran, and had some time also working as like a physical therapist. But really what Rose should be known for was that she wrote like a lot. In her town, the local newspaper almost didn't pass from the early 1920s when she was kind of finally back in town as an adult, although she also wrote when she was in high school, through to her death. There was not a week in which she did not have something almost in the newspaper. And it ranged phenomenally from local history episodes and anecdotes to kind of broader regional history, to stories about herself or her family, and also, importantly, stories about people who had just passed away. In the process of writing this much, some scholars, largely because her brother was very famous, Taylor Gordon was one of the most well-known members of the Black Renaissance, of the Harlem Renaissance era. He was a jazz singer, wrote the best-selling book, Born to Be. He left White Sulphur Springs as a young man and then came back as an old man. But because of his kind of notoriety, Rose kind of kept all of his papers, but she also kept everything she wrote as well. So we know a ton about Rose. And scholars, including Michael Johnson, have written about her very eloquently. So if you've read that book, you might think, well, I don't remember any sections about Rose as this like great environmental writer. And that's fair. It's only, though, because I think the ways that we have told stories about man and nature do not commend themselves to the types of stories that Rose Gordon told about man and nature. For instance, Rose did not tell stories of tracking elk through knee-deep snow in November blizzards until she found the elk that she had, shot earlier the night before. She did not tell stories of, perhaps romanticized battles with trout that somehow mirrored the internal struggle we all have to find oneself as she fished along the Smith River. And this is despite the fact that Rose regularly filled both of her elk tags. You got 2 elk back then. She regularly filled both her elk tags, and consistently, not quite on a weekly basis, but frequently would go out and catch trout in sufficient quantities for special events at her cafe. So she could have told those stories, but that's not the kind of story that Rose told about man and nature. Rose told stories not about man and nature. Rose told stories about young girls like herself who would venture out after church picnics in the Judith Basin area, go high up into the mountain meadows over the Smith River Valley, and see the sun filtering through the trees on the flowers in the meadows, and realizing, in one letter she wrote to her friend, that she saw every single possible color you could have imagined in the wildflowers. And she reflected on it and said, I think this is probably the reason why I can't understand racism in America today. Here we have, God's creation attesting the diversity of the world. And for her, she kind of commented on this through this nature writing and this anecdote, that really, prejudice and racism were the unnatural intrusion into the world that she knew. She also did this thing over and over again in the memoir pieces she wrote about friends. Whenever someone in White Sulphur Springs would die, she wouldn't write obituaries. She would write pieces that would range from small couplets or poems to 800-word, essays about what this person meant to them. And when someone would pass away, there was one moment in particular that sticks with me where she ends it by talking about the path that was worn from her back porch to this person's front door. And then when this person died, that left on the physical landmarks, the physical land in White Sulphur Springs was the connection between people. This is a very different type of relationship between man and nature than you get even in someone like Norman MacLean, who is honest and who's thoughtful and contemplative. This is not adversarial. This is someone who is going out, being refreshed, rejuvenated by nature, thinks of nature as a place not only of solace, but also of connection. And in the process of Rose kind of highlighting this just for me as someone reading through her papers, I realized that we have quite a few other examples in Montana's history that make me wonder, well, Rose Gordon, as the daughter of enslaved people, as a black woman living in the West, she is an awfully reliable narrator of this type of story. It's not to say that other people could not have had similar experiences and come to similar conclusions while out in nature, but the fact that she did in the ways that she did, I think come to something, she came to it very honestly. But Rose is incredibly unique in Montana. And honestly, Rose is incredibly unique in Western history. She will probably, in the future, there's much more work being done on her. She's going to be the feature of a documentary in the next few years. She will probably go down as one of Montana's most interesting literary figures, if only for the kind of the unique space that she holds and the voice that she is able to offer when all of our other voices kind of look like Ivan Doig. And that's just so rare that if we were waiting for Rose Gordon, we're going to miss some of the other stories about humans and nature that come out of Black history in Montana. This photo is a story. And it's a picture of the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Club. There's about 20 people. They're out in Colorado Gulch, and they've posed. This is one of several photos. And it was not until earlier this year, I'm a painter as well, and I went out to Colorado Gulch to try and do some plein air painting out in it was actually winter. And as I was going down the roads, I remembered this photo. I'm like, man, this is a lot farther out of town than I had kind of always thought it to be. And then as I looked at this photo, it seemed to me that this is another example. The photographer acted in a snapshot as a storyteller. They might have been trying to capture something, but today this is a story from the past. My question for us is, are we ready to be our own interpreters of what this photo means? I was definitely not ready, and I'm probably still not in many ways ready to be the interpreter of this photo. After writing and researching on Black history for now the last almost a decade, I can say that there are some things that would help us be more faithful, better interpreters. It would be nice to know who all the people are. I can identify like a couple. I can see Octavia Bridgewater when she's, right here. I can see a few people whose names I know. I would like to know, what did they think about kind of the broader conversation that was happening in America in the 1920s and 30s around conservation and use of public lands? Because this used to be state land. Now it's all private. This was a photo probably taken on in state land in Colorado Gulch. Did they think about the conservation movement of the early 20th century that was propagated and pushed into public consciousness by a group of men who did, the conservation movement as a whole gave us some really wonderful things, but if you go and look at all the names, they're not necessarily the best people. They could have read very easily New York Times columns in the 20s and 30s written by Madison Grant about Glacier being the crown of the continent and one of the greatest treasures that Montana has, and then they could have turned it over and recognized by the 1930s, long after this photo was taken, that Madison Grant was Adolf Hitler's most cherished kind of writer on racial eugenics. And Madison Grant was not alone in the early conservation movement. This was a movement that was very antagonistic. It was the preservation of certain types of resources for certain types of people. We have luckily been able to slowly, over the last 100 years, push beyond those very narrow beginnings. I would argue that they are part of the pushing very early on, right at that same moment. That information could help you be an interpreter of this photo. Another thing that I've looked at and I've recognized is I realize no, that's actually good. What's my time on? To 7:15? Is that when? Perfect. That as I've looked at this photo, there is something else, and it's the one I'll leave you with, that I think we kind of need in our present moment. On social media apps today, there seems to be an interesting resurgence in a certain narrative about humans and nature. If you haven't seen it, if your algorithms or whatever it is don't tell you these stories, there is an enormous number of young people, almost all white, who are walking around the world right now. They are on day 400 or 200 or 100 of their trek across Asia or their Pacific Coast Trail, and there's hundreds of these accounts and stories and people kind of monetizing an experience with nature. And it is individual, it's a little voyeuristic, but that's how they make money. But it is primarily one person going out by themselves and learning things that we're not really sure. It's really just you get an episodic snippet of wherever they are in Nepal or in Africa. This is the diametrically opposite story that doesn't show up on, as far as I can tell, at least on my Instagram feed. This is a group of people who could have met at their church, and often did, could have met in backyards, and often did, could have met at community hall functions, like the Black Elks or somewhere like that, and they often did. But they, in this instance, and I'm guessing my friend Nancy Mahoney at the Extreme History Project, when I was doing this talk earlier, told me to look at their footwear and guarantee that they did not walk probably the almost 7 or 8 miles at least to Colorado Gulch. They probably got into 6 pickup trucks. I'm imagining some of those kids are in the back looking out. This is an ordeal. This is an event. But it's also 30 people together outside. It's a totally different narrative. It's a totally different positionality to our experience with the natural world. This one still exists. Like, people still go out and do things together. But we're often bombarded, the stories we've told about ourselves, whether it's coming down from the Hugh Glass legend all the way to so-and-so walking across from the UK to Vietnam. Going out and being alone in nature, which I love, cannot be the only way that we talk about this, because it will lead to a very myopic way that we tell stories about the past. And it will cut out perspectives like these from the kind of the encyclopedia of our narrative storytelling. So I will end with kind of a call to what we can do with this information, because as we might have seen from kind of the early slide, there has already been a lot written on Black history in Montana and the West. That's the tip of the iceberg is not exactly the correct metaphor. We literally just started. I was at the Western History Conference last year, and we have a kind of a cohort of all people working on Black Western studies. And there are like 30 or 40 graduate students, let alone the tenured professors and public historians and writers who have already taken up this as what they're going to talk about. There are 30 or 40 young people who are writing detailed, thoroughly researched dissertations on African Americans in Western history, some in Montana, many in the Rocky Mountains. And what I've thought about over the last summer as I kind of put this talk together was, is there a way that we can prepare ourselves as members of our narrative communities to hear stories about the past with a little bit more perspective, with a better context, so that we don't kind of all do the thing that I was worried about when I was writing my dissertation at first? Am I writing just a surface level history? Are we engaging with Black history just as a novelty, well, that's an interesting thing that I didn't know about, my community or wherever, and then we kind of just go on without any impact taking place? Black history as this kind of phenomenon that slows our assumptions about our ability to be our own interpreters, I think is incredibly good. And if you were to take that out, and for the next years as you go and hear stories about humans and nature, if you're like me and you're watching the Vigilante Day Parade next year and some other story kind of gets taken up as the most popular, are you able to say, man, what does that story say? What's its meaning? What was its original meaning? And is there another set of stories from the past that I can pair with it? I think those lead to more just and empathetic communities, narrative or otherwise. Thank you. And we have time for questions, which is good because if you have questions specifically about like the Black experience in Montana and the outdoors and stuff like that, I did write a whole chapter on it, so I should theoretically know answers to those questions as well.
What surprised you the most?
Wait, just a moment.
What surprised you the most when you were doing this? You know, we always come with some thoughts that are already there.
Yeah. I think one of the things that surprised me the most, well, going back to the research I did for the book, when I was doing the chapter on the Black wilderness experience, one of the things that surprised me, certainly more than I was expecting it to, was the way in which African Americans in the early, like 20th century and the late 19th century, that they, even though the discourse around what it meant to go out and, you know, be a man in nature, which is really how it's like, that's what's in all the books, that's what if you read Roughing It by Teddy Roosevelt, that's what it's all about. The communities in Montana, urban, where the African American populations primarily were, and rural, did not care about the broader discourses. These are people who, as you can imagine, living in Montana, were every bit kind of the outdoor, not just enthusiasts, but like they had to be outdoors because prior to, you know, our time, you know, being so much more filled with leisure, yeah, labor was outside. And these are people primarily working in hard jobs, and that did not. So I mean, you have lots of people who are working outside, who are engaging in, you know, economic pastimes that are bringing them out into the, you know, into the woods, onto the prairies, wherever. But I was most surprised at how much the recreation, the early recreation side of things was also present in Black sources. One of my favorite things was there's a newspaper that was published here in Helena, the Montana Plain Dealer. It was a Black-owned and operated newspaper. They had like a little bit of local news every week. It was usually called like the Dope Book or something like that. And their running jokes over and over and over again were on you know, people who were specifically or particularly bad fishermen or terrible shots. And they would constant jabs at things that we would recognize as kind of like, you know, outdoors recreation and kind of that type of lifestyle. And it was present, and it could be, you know, used as an inside joke, so much so that you recognize that it's like this is common. It wouldn't have been out of the ordinary at all. So maybe something like that. Sure. Yes.
I had a question. You had brought up transience at the beginning of the talk about how there was an impermanence that they were, even if people who were not white were not denigrated or like overtly, there was overt hatred towards them. They were not considered permanent. I did read your book last summer. It's very good, but I think at the beginning of that book you talk about how there was Black families whose in the census record was written in pencil. Are there other symptoms like that of that impermanence in other cities or in other parts of Montana?
Yeah, there are. So what you're referring to is that in the 1910 census of Montana, something really interesting happens. They make a local, so the editor of that newspaper, Joseph Bass, the census bureaucrats in Helena get him to take the census of the Black community. He does, on official census paper and everything, he does the census, he enumerates it himself, It's not geographic by origin. Sometimes next door neighbors are like way far apart. And then they took those names, which is an imperfect census because he couldn't possibly have known, the 400 plus people living in Helena, where they could have been. He would have known lots of them. He got a good deal of it, but it was like, that's a very imperfect, unofficial way of doing a census. That's not what they're supposed to have done. And then they took his version, evidently in the official census, when the census enumerators were going around town in 1910, every time they came to a family that was or they thought was black, they skipped them. They just didn't enumerate them. And then at the end of each section, they took Bass's census and they wrote down into the official census the names of all the African Americans in Helena. But they did it in pencil, which is a very bizarre thing to have done, considering this is like a bureaucratic office. They had things that they just did certain ways, and that would not have been one of them. So the whole thing is very confusing. But it does, I argued in the beginning of that, that type of mentality towards racial others is like at least a source-based symptom of viewing people as not, permanent. So the question is like, now are there other things? And the stories, to kind of go to the topic, the stories that we've told about ourselves absolutely mention this. And I'll skip out of Montana for a moment just because the ones that I'm thinking of are kind of very fresh. In Wyoming, the stories that they told about themselves, one of the chapters that I wrote was on a history pageant that told and retold Wyoming's history, and in the 1920s was written by a very interesting progressive woman who, at the end of it, she's trying to make a point about who really belongs in Wyoming, who gets to call this place home. So the whole plot of the play is this person is trying to woo the beautiful young woman in Wyoming, and he has to go through all these lessons to do so. Black figures don't show up in her account of this of Wyoming's history at all. So there's impermanence via absence. Then, and there's other cases, if you go across the West, you'll hear stories about prominent figures or important like black firsts, and then they'll say that so-and-so built this hotel and they were very prominent, and then they died or they left and no one's ever done anything like it ever again. So this first figure becomes the last time that they ever talk about black history in these places. That's a kind of a discursive way. If you elevate someone, and those are usually very kind, celebratory pieces. They often ignore the fact that yes, Barney Ford in Cheyenne or Denver may have passed away, but there's still 700 to 1,000 other African Americans living in Cheyenne when he dies, who are doing things, 3 of which happen to own hotels. But I mean, that type of narrative storytelling can give us the wrong impression, but it often happens not so intentionally. Like, it's not a verbatim. You kind of have to step back and ask yourself, what are the implications of this type of storytelling? Yeah, and many other things like that.
Did she allow Native Americans to be in that pageant?
So yes, but also in a vanishing kind of way. The actual Native people that she imagined were not actual Native people, and she didn't talk about the Crow or the Cheyenne or any group that would have been relevant to Wyoming's history. They were generalized as red men, and they literally, in one part of the play, they kind of impose on the character he's played by a young white man, but he is given the name Vitavu. So if anyone is familiar with the big outcropping of rocks between Cheyenne and Laramie, it's kind of a mecca for mountain climbers and rock climbers. It's named, that's where she performed the pageant the first time, and it's named after her play. He's not a native character, but the idea is that he starts as this quasi-native character and turns into an acceptable young white man to marry Wyoming at the end. So Native people also vanish and become, not transient, but disappear. Yeah.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, they shut the library down at 8, so we'll have to run out.
I'm curious, you mentioned about the census and how the black people were counted with pencil. And I'm wondering, did they do the same thing with Native Americans or Asians, only just with black?
And it was only in this one instance. It's a very odd event. And it's not been repeated, as far as I can tell, in any other instance. So
And
it
what
was.
year?
This was
What year?
1910. And we don't know why. We don't know why they asked Joseph Bass to enumerate the black community. It is possible that he asked to. He might have wanted to, especially, there is a possibility that he was interested in doing it because in the 1910 census there is a column that says, do you own or rent property? If so, what is the value? Joseph Bass also seemed to care very much about how much property the black community in Helena, how wealthy they had become, how much material goods and property they had accrued over the years, and he knew all this. So it is entirely possible that he was interested in making sure that the black community was accurately represented by the census, because there is the very real possibility, as happened in the past, that maybe you come to a black family, you don't even ask them if they rent or own their home, and you just put rent. They may have owned their home. In fact, in Helena, 40 to 60% over those few decades owned homes. There was a very large kind of working middle class in Helena. It is possible that he wanted to do that so as to not let that fact be disappeared. But he definitely did not he counted some people twice. He missed some families altogether. So it was not a perfect count, but then when the census bureaucrats got it, it became, you can't even read it, actually, on Ancestry. You can see it, you can see that they're marked as black, but you cannot make out their names or any of their information because it is so faded. His version is crossed out and marked as unofficial, and it is also digitized. But I sometimes wonder how close we came at different points in spring cleaning at the Census Bureau to losing that copy, which easily could have been thrown away. And then we would have known nothing about, at that point, the 6th largest black community in the West. So.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Wood. We're so grateful for your piece. And thank you all for being here tonight. We'll see you next time.